Good evening. Welcome to all of you. Let us begin this presentation on married saints with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Lord, we ask you that this presentation on the married saints might be of use to each one who is here or viewing us on internet, that it might be motivating and both for married and unmarried alike to understand the beautiful call to holiness that you give and that has been presented in these couples in the married state. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Just a very brief personal anecdote before I begin this presentation. I became interested in this topic years ago, about 23 years ago, when a couple that I was spiritual director for asked me for a retreat the week before they got married. So most couples are going bananas over all the details. They wanted a retreat for a weekend, and I wondered what I could say to them. We talked about many things, but I thought, well, I'll look up some married saints. Because saints are given to us as models, as intercessors. But when I began to look them up, I discovered there were precious few. And that piqued my interest, and I've never lost it in over 20 years. So I've been researching this topic for 2 decades. I don't want to spend talking about myself, but about these people. This presentation will be in 2 parts. The first part will take 15 or 20 minutes and is the most boring part, but there's some preliminary things we need to look at before we enter into the specifics. Then the other hour will be looking at 7 couples, the 7 that appear on the poster advertising this presentation. And there'll be time at the end for questions and answers. Although if you have a burning question, you can ask at any point. Okay? So this is just a way of introducing the theme. How many of these saints or holy people do you recognize? Do you know the names of their spouses? Sometimes one is much better known and nobody knows the name of the spouse. I think that's not fair. What kind of life had they as a married couple? What were the challenges they faced, and how did they confront them? So this is a study of conjugal spirituality, that is, Christian life in the married vocation. And we're going to look at that through the experience and lives of what I like to call well-married saints. I'll explain that a little further on. The perspective of this presentation is a study of conjugal spirituality, that is, of Christian married life, considered not from a sociological perspective of surveys and statistics. 64% of Catholic married people do this or don't do that. No. Nor from a dogmatic perspective, which is drawing conclusions from theoretical ideal situations and talking about the virtues and the qualities of a marriage and so on. But rather from a unique point of view, namely the study of those married people who have been or who are on the way to being proposed, declared by the Catholic Church as blessed and saints. These couples are living examples given to us for our study of the married vocation as a Christian path of holiness. There are several preliminary points to consider before we look at particular cases of modern married saints. I put some of these in a kind of a colloquial form, as if there was somebody that was really peeved by this idea of studying the saints. Why do we have saints and blesseds in the first place? What are they good for? What purpose do they serve? Second, aren't there enough saints already? Why do we need more? Third, why are there so few saints, married saints, if the vast majority of Christians are married? What happened? Why are there so few? And what's your particular take on this subject? That would be somebody asking me, what are you getting at? What are you looking for? So I'd like to present answers to these 4 areas first, and then we'll have a basic common ground to begin looking at particular couples. So why do we have saints and blesseds in the first place? What are they good for? What purpose do they serve? There are 3 basic roles of the saints in our lives according to the Catholic Church. The saints are models, objects of our devotion, and intercessors. Saints are canonized and offered to the Christian faithful as models of integral Christian life and exemplars of virtue in different states and conditions of life. Thus, for married Christians, married saints have a special witness and example to give of the resources, challenges, and specific virtues of this most common Christian vocation. But the very demanding Christian. The fact that it's common does not mean that it's easy. So married saints are needed to face the challenges of married life. My first intention here is to offer contemporary models of conjugal spirituality. Second, the Church also encourages us to have a healthy and balanced devotion to the saints. That is, friendship, love. I hope to spark in each one here a love for the married saints whose conjugal lives are ever so briefly presented in the following slides. And the saints also intercede for us. So Christian couples today would do well to invoke the intercession of these married saints and blesseds who are concerned to live their conjugal vocation in its fullness. Second question, why do we need more saints? Aren't there enough already? There are hundreds. Well, while there are quite a few examples, even of married saints in the scriptures, the early church, the medieval and post-Reformation eras, many of these saints from previous centuries lived lives with which the contemporary families may have difficulty identifying. Biblical examples are always valid in Christian spirituality, but they often is not much relevant to specific challenges of a family life today, like family planning, homeschooling, formal education, social media, professional ethics, political engagement. What does the Book of Ruth tell us about those things? What a saint of Islamic Spain tell us about those? The socio-political and economic differences are very great between saintly medieval kings and queens, of which there are quite a few canonized, and nobles in a feudal society, and present-day working men and women, especially in today's secularized Western world of democratic institutions, networks of corruption, social movements, worldwide economic and political interdependence. And likewise, certain presumptions of gender roles which until 50 or 60 years ago were taken to be part of the basic Christian doctrine on family life, have been challenged by contemporary views of the family, both in Western and in non-Western countries. For example, women working professionally outside of the home, women's role in politics, the so-called reproductive rights, and the challenge to the family itself presented by the LGBTQ gender ideology. So we're facing questions, families in particular are facing questions that it seems the old saints don't have ready answers for. So there is an urgent need to present to today's married Christians modern saintly examples of conjugal life, where current challenges such as labor relations, militant atheism, world wars, social protest, mental illness, family spirituality, tremendous medical advances, lay missionary work, ecological awareness, fake news, and social media, to name but a few, all come into play. This presentation introduces you to a variety of modern married saints from different continents, cultures, professions, and socioeconomic backgrounds, in order to highlight the magnificently diverse conjugal holiness, which is one of the best kept secrets and the least appreciated splendors of the church. So, why are there so few married saints if there are good things to have around? Even counting all the saints who are married, many of whom were canonized not because of their marriage, but because when they were widowed, they were martyrs or founded a religious congregation especially, or did works of charity on the margin of their marriage. But including all of those, some of whom were bishops in the early church and so on, it seems that the percentage of married saints to non-married saints in the church is something like 7 to 10%. I did this counting saints page by page in 2 or 3 collections of lives of the saints. So why are there so few if the majority of Christians follow the married vocation? Is marriage then not a way of holiness, but a trap? It catches people and lures them away from holiness? Or is this a plot of celibate clerics to denigrate the married state, that most holy people are religious and priests? Happily, no to both. There are other reasons for the disproportion of married saints to other categories of saints. We needn't have recourse to conspiracy theories. There are several non-intentional causes of the extremely low number of married saints in the Catholic liturgical calendar and list of saints. These are historical reasons, logistical, financial, and cultural reasons, but are too complicated to go into here and would take away time from the most important part of this presentation, which is presenting you with concrete couples. The good news is that in the last 25 years or so, the Catholic Church has done much to remedy this situation by recognizing the holiness of, that is, by canonizing many married people of our times. It is the intention of this presentation to remedy in some small way this dearth of known married saints by providing very specific and focused information on several modern married saints or saints to be, and hopefully to provoke you to research and learn more about them. Because today is just like when you go through Eastern Market and they have olives on a toothpick to taste. It's just a taste of what's to come. And the last question, my particular focus for the study of these saints' lives, is most of the couples presented here are not both canonized. In fact, only one couple. The other spouse may not even be in the process of canonization. Some studies on this topic focus solely upon those married people who have been declared saints or blesseds, ignoring the contribution which their spouses made to their life of holiness. And I've come across one thick book. It's kind of like a page on each married saint. It has over 300 married saints from the Old Testament up to the present. Sometimes it doesn't even name the spouse. Now, my approach is to study them as holy couples, regardless of the formal canonical status of one or the other, although some are in fact in process. In none of the cases presented here did the spouses of the canonized figure constitute an obstacle, a contradiction, or a living martyrdom to the saintly spouses, as in the case of philandering, abusive, or violent spouses. There's one couple you might think came close of these I'm going to present, but they loved each other dearly despite a major difficulty. So this approach is based upon the conviction that conjugal holiness is necessarily a matter of two in one. God has given spouses to each other to help them on the road to holiness. And I'm convinced, I've also worked about 20 years with married couples, the married couples movement called Teams of Our Lady, and that, as well as general priestly experience, has convinced me that holiness comes by couples in the marital state. This methodology is to focus intently on their conjugal relationship, their married relationship, what they shared, how they treated each other, how they confronted family tragedies as well as a couple, their mutual support in the joys and sorrows of parenthood, the apostolates they realized together in complementarity, their conjugal prayer as a couple, how they faced in relation to their spouse the eventual sacrifice of separation, martyrdom, or widowhood. I mention only in passing other laudable aspects of these holy people and many notable events in their lives, except in as much as they shed light on the conjugal relationship of the couple. An example of that is Thomas More, whom we celebrate tomorrow, his feast day. Thomas More was best known for his Vice Chancellor of England and his standing up to Henry VIII over a matter of conscience on the indissolubility of marriage. But he also had a wonderful family life. But if you look at most biographies of Thomas More, they pass over the family life and the marriage all together in one chapter, and then he may have 6 chapters on stages of his process. So in each case, I have also sought contemporary sources, letters between spouses or family members, diaries or journals, in some cases live testimony of children or even of spouses in the process of canonization. Okay, that's the boring part. Now we come to a brief introduction to the lives of some well-married saints. We're going to take them pretty much in order across the top and then the bottom. Anybody know this first couple on the left? Yes.
They look to me like Pierre and Juliette Toussaint.
Pierre and Juliette Toussaint. Very good. Anybody know about them now that the name rings a bell? These were Haitian-born slaves. This is the oldest couple we'll be looking at, but they come into the modern era, the beginning of the 1800s. They both ended up as free citizens of the U.S. in New York. They were brought here by their masters, mistresses, but eventually given their freedom. Or Pierre was given his freedom. He could have bought it, but he was more interested in freeing his sister and the woman that he wanted to marry, Juliette. Pierre was known for his exquisite charity to rich and poor alike, to French-speaking speakers and English speakers, to Catholics and non-Catholics, to the sick, the orphaned, immigrants. And Juliette, his wife, we said he wouldn't exchange her for anybody in the world. She was a much less known figure, but she complimented him in their charity. Pierre was a hairdresser. It turned out he was given that profession by his master before he went back to Haiti to arrange some affairs and never came back because he died in Haiti during the Haitian Revolution. And so Pierre had this livelihood, which was one of the few things blacks could do in that era, about the year 1800. But it was a very lucrative position. He was extremely prudent in his words. He never gossiped among the high society, and he was universally respected. One example where we have positive testimony about their complementarity was there was a Frenchman whom Pierre had known in better days, who had come down in the world and now was not able to support himself, even for food. So Pierre, aware that he would be mortified if he saw a black slave bringing him his dinner, and he probably would have been too proud to accept it, Pierre arranged for a food cooked by Juliette to be carried to his house by somebody else and left there, probably ring the doorbell and running. And then one day he was commenting to Juliette without any idea that it was her. He said, "Oh yes, I'm very well known. I have many friends. One of them sends me a dinner cooked by a French chef." And they said they later on laughed about that because Pierre wasn't a cook, but he was out and around the city. He knew many people. Juliette was more of a homebody, but what they did for this Frenchman, fallen into poverty, Pierre would also find the sick, even during times of epidemic, would cross the barriers where blocks were cordoned off, and he would go in and attend to the sick. And when he found someone really in need of daily care, he would bring them home. And Juliette would be the one that would care for them during the day. They adopted Pierre's sister's daughter. His sister died of TB within less than a year after giving birth. And the doctors were sure that the infant would not last a year even. Well, with Pierre and Juliette's paternal and maternal attention, they spared no efforts to bring her around and, educate her. She lived until 14, when tuberculosis had a quick flare-up and she died. They also housed some street boys, what we call them now, homeless children in the basement of their house, and they paid for their education, clothed them, and gave them a trade, apprenticing them to somebody who it seemed they would be adequate for that type of work. I'm just running through these. The last tidbit on Pierre is one day when he was getting old, he lived until his early 80s, when he must have been in his upper 70s, around 80, one of his clients said, "Pierre, why don't you retire? You're richer than anybody I know." And he said, "Madame, if I retire, I have enough for myself, but not enough for others." So this is a man very well known in New York City, even today, buried in St. Patrick's Cathedral, the only layman buried alongside the archbishops and bishops of New York. Frederick and Amelia Ozanam. Does Ozanam ring a bell? He is known as the founder of the St. Vincent de Paul Society, which is now in over 130 countries in the world. It's a vibrant, charitable organization. Frederick, I'll let you read this. I'm not, in this case, reading everything on the screen. A few other points more focused on their marriage. Frederick was seeking a spouse more worthy than himself. He wanted someone who would challenge him, who would lift him up in his Christian life, would be more devout than he was. And this was a man of Christian convictions, who would be more serious when he was sometimes lukewarm. So how many couples today look for someone more worthy of God's grace than themselves? He wasn't into, he realized the importance of looks and of character, but he wanted someone that would be a vessel of grace for him. Amelia supported and trusted in Frederick's option for the poor. He had two offers of teaching positions in Paris, and then one 6 times the price of the Paris one, which is just like an adjunct professor at the Sorbonne. He had an offer in Lyon, where he was from and his wife was from, and his wife's family lived. That was 6 times the income of the other one, which would really just be barely to survive on. But Frederick wanted to go back to Paris, where he had studied and where he had founded this society, because of the slums of Paris. He wanted to be near the poor and to continue this work that he had begun. His would-be father-in-law had to think twice about letting his daughter marry a man like that. But she gave her own word that she trusted him and she was ready to face whatever was to come. They were married on the 23rd of June, forget the year, but on the 23rd of every month, Frederick gave a simple gift to his wife. It might be a potted plant, even a flower, something not expensive, but that was a way of reminding her, I thank you for the gift of your life, for being my wife, for the gift, and I thank God for that. That was until his dying day. On the 23rd of every month, he did not forget. Just a touching, tender gesture. His life ended very early at 40 years of age. He was sickly all his life. As a child, he almost died several times. And then as a researcher and a university professor, he had crises of health that kept getting deeper and more frequent until, and finally at about the age 40, they knew he was dying. And he and his wife and their only child went to the shore of Italy where they thought the climate would be healthier to spend some of his last days. And when he turned 40, he wrote a beautiful and very wrenching prayer based on the Canticle of Hezekiah in the Bible, where he says, in the midterm of my life, I must depart and go to the netherworld. Isaiah had told King Hezekiah, who was a very devout person, get your things in order, you're going to die. The Lord has told me. And Hezekiah turned to the wall and cried and prayed, Lord, you know how I've served you all these years. Must I die now? And the Lord sent Isaiah to tell him, you have another 15 years of life. And so Frederick, at age 40, half of the biblical 70 years or 80 for those who are strong, was dying. His daughter was still very young. His wife, who we leave as a widow, was young. His professional work was just at a cusp of beginning to really churn out a mammoth work that he had proposed. And he said, Lord, can it be that the same prayers that were offered when I was a baby and recovered, if many more people now would offer them, would you accept that? Maybe, maybe you're asking for the Holocaust of my whole life. And if so, even if I'm chained to my bed of pain for the rest of my days, I will not be able to thank you enough for all that you have given me. Beautiful, beautiful testimony to his character. Louis and Célie in French Martin, the parents of Saint Therese. He's probably the best known couple. They were beatified in the early 2000s and canonized in 2016 in the context of the World Synod of Bishops on the Family. So they raised the family they were worthy more of heaven than of earth, Therese said. And they had initially each wanted to be a sister and a religious or a priest, and their vocations, as they understood them, were frustrated. After meeting each other and discovering almost an identical spirituality and desire, in 3 months they got married. 3-month courtship. So I wouldn't recommend it to people, but they were both mature individuals that lived on their own and knew what they wanted. They had 9 children, 4 of whom died in infancy or childhood. One of those times, I think is key, is when their 5-year-old daughter died. Most of the other 3 died, I think, less than 1 year old. Infant mortality, we're talking 150 years ago, was much higher than it is today. So, Celia tells in a letter to one of her family members that when Louis came in and saw his daughter laid out on the table for the wake, he said, "Oh, my Helene, my Helene." Just a very heart-wrenching story. And then she says, and then we offered her back to God. We offered her back to God. How many couples, when a child dies unexpectedly, without known cause, from one day to the next, would take that attitude. Many would accuse God, which in the end is a kind of prayer too. But to give her back to God signifies that they understood that she was not their possession. She was entrusted to them. God had permitted that she die as a young child, so they gave her back to God. And they ended up giving all of their children to God because the 5, all the girls that survived to adulthood and some to a ripe old age, entered the Carmel or one other monastery, became religious. And they wanted to have a missionary and a priest's son. Their only 2 sons died in infancy, but Therese of Lisieux was a providential answer to their prayers, who was the patroness of missions, the Catholic Church, and who, as a Carmelite, had a special vocation of praying for priests. This is a Mexican couple, Pancho and Conchita. She never found any obstacle to her spiritual life in the love of her husband, and who was a good and respectful man. Here they had a courtship of 9 years, because it began when she was 13. I think that was like the present-day quinceañera, where at a certain age, a girl comes out socially. And very shortly after that, a very good young man proposed. Her parents did not say no, but nor did they say yes. They said, you have to wait. And he waited 8 years. He had a very happy marriage, about 40 years married. Conchita ended up being a mystic. She had revelations that began while she was mother of a family and spouse. For years, she would write down what the Lord spoke to her and filled 60 notebooks of revelations that have been gone over by theologians. And even when she was alive, they submitted her and some of her writings to a theological panel to see if it was authentic or if these were fake. And the judgment of the panel was that they are of God. And then when her husband died, she remained at the head of a family of, I believe, 9 children, maybe 2 of whom died in childhood. And I wouldn't be surprised if she would be one day a doctor of the church. But I said there, she never had found any obstacle between love of God and love of her husband. When she went to communion, she said she thought of Pancho. And when she was with Pancho, she thought of Jesus in communion. So the love that theologically is from God, and that we have the ability to love because of God's love in us, she experienced in an extraordinary way. I would say they had a wonderful marriage. But she discovered that a wonderful marriage was not enough. She needed more. And on 2 retreats that she made, one at about 5 years of marriage, it was the first retreat in her life. And then the second one about 5 years later were just transforming experiences for her and catapulted her into a very mystical, deep relationship with the Lord. And she realized that what she had been expecting of marriage, it wasn't that marriage disappointed her, but it could not fill her the way that a relationship with the Lord could only do. She also, as a widow, founded 5 congregations of religious sisters and priests. There's Missionaries of the Holy Spirit are a missionary group of priests founded by this woman, this married woman, actually after her widowhood. There's a lovely couple, a fascinating story. If you read Magnificat magazine, you'll recognize the name, Elizabeth Lesser. She had the unfortunate discovery very briefly before her marriage that her fiancé was not just not a practicing Catholic as she thought, but was an atheist. And so she asked him to promise that he would not be an obstacle to her practice of the faith. And he promised her and kept his promise for a couple of years until his own atheism, cooked in a pressure cooker with anti-clerical colleagues and readings of anti-Christian literature, just made him incapable of respecting his wife's faith. And he tried to start destroying it by ridiculing opinions of different things, making petty obstacles to her going into the sacraments, giving her books to read. They're both very high-class, well-educated couple. So he gave her books to read that were aimed at destroying a belief, Christian belief. And he almost succeeded. But one day he gave her a book by Ernst Renan, History of Early Christianity or something. It was a very tendentious book with arguments that held no water. And she, as an intelligent woman who had had a good sort of private education, as one received in the high society in those days, she decided to find out the truth and look for more reliable sources that held together. So she began a process of collecting books and studying philosophy, scripture, theology, fathers of the church, councils, apologetics. Might have missed one major area, but this was incredible. And a woman in those days, no women studied theology in the Catholic circles at any rate. Not even any lay people. Seminaries were solely for priests, seminarians. But she fortified herself in the faith, in the practice of the sacraments. She had fallen away from going to Mass for 2 years. So I say her husband almost succeeded in destroying her faith. But then she reacted and grew stronger, and he found himself willy-nilly being pulled towards her belief. He would only recognize it after her death. And this is a couple I mentioned that almost not a living hell, but she suffered greatly. And yet they loved each other tenderly. It was just that religion was the big harping point. She finally realized that all her prayers and sacrifices for his conversion, because she wanted to be with him in the faith. She would call him the one I love more than anyone in the world. She wanted to be with him in the presence of Jesus. But she finally thought, maybe it's only the gift of my life. If I offer my life for him, and that brings about his conversion, and we can be together for all eternity. She offered her life and died young in her 30s of cancer. That was a fairly long, several-year process. And after she died, her husband found what she wrote called a testament It was oriented to her husband. Said, when I die, I will have completed the payment for your soul. That's the language that we perhaps wouldn't use today. But she said, I've asked the Lord, no greater love has a wife than to give her life for her husband. Changing the words of Jesus. Well, he might, if that had been the only thing he had seen, he might have remained on the fence. But Elizabeth's sister had managed to save from the fire what Elizabeth wanted to burn before she died. Her journal of like 15 years, where she poured out her soul on the pages of a journal. And she had instructed her sister to burn it when she was dead. But her sister said, you know, that might serve your husband. And so she thought, okay. It was given to Felix, who was still a dyed-in-the-wool atheist. And he was bowled over. By the end of the year, after having read all her journal, he came back to the sacraments, became a Catholic, a daily communicant, entered the Dominican laity, and then wanted to be a priest, but his spiritual director said no. It seemed like an inordinate zeal of a newly converted, but he continued asking, petitioning. About 4 years later, he was admitted and was ordained a Dominican priest. He had 25 years of marriage. He had 27 years of priesthood. Except for the last couple of years in the 1940s and 50s, when he was ill, he spent much of his priesthood publishing her journal and her correspondence, some other writings of his wife, and opening, petitioning, working for the promotion of her cause of beatification. She is now a servant of God. It's the first public stage of recognition that church offers. Then there's venerable, and there's blessed, and saint. So we may still in our lifetimes, because the church is kind of fast-tracking some of these processes which previous centuries have gone on for decades and decades, or even centuries. So there at the bottom you have Felix as a Dominican. Takashi Nagai, I'm sure you've never heard of him, and Midori Moriyama. Midori, the wife, was a member of an old Catholic family that they were inheritors of the faith, almost a miracle that the Catholic faith was preserved in Japan clandestinely for over 2 centuries without any missionaries, any priests. But the Japanese Christians, called hidden Christians, maintained the faith after the expulsion and martyrdom of all the priests in the country, Japanese or not. So she was from an old, faithful Catholic family. Takashi Nagai was an atheist. He'd been raised as a Shintoist, but when he went to medical school, dissecting cadavers and things like that, he lost all his religious sense and believed in materialism. Science would be the religion of the future. But when his mother died and he got to her bedside only when she was unable to speak, he said he saw in her eyes a very clear message that this is not all there is. There is a life after death. He said it shook him. It shook his faith in materialism, because he knew his mother, and her eyes, her look was so penetrated him that he could put words on it and say, this is not all there is. She was not a Christian, she was a Shintoist, but a believer. So he went back to medical school, and he had, in the meantime, discovered the work of Blaise Pascal, pensée, thoughts, meditations. He was a Christian scientist, Catholic scientist in France, sort of a philosopher. And upon reading his book, Takashi was even more in a quandary as to what is real, what is to believe. So he decided to, when he went to medical school, to room with a Catholic family. Because Catholics were the main denomination that he had heard of or was interested in. So he took up residence in the family of Midori. And her father, Midori was off at a teaching job in another city. But her father and mother welcomed Takashi. Her father was a very educated Catholic. So he explained, in as much as Takashi wanted to know, and not pushing him, not giving him more than he was ready for, but began explaining about the Catholic faith, and became very convincing. On the Christmas Eve, the first Christmas Eve in Nagasaki, rooming with this family, the father invited him to go to midnight mass. The daughter was home for Christmas. He said, "Well, I'm not a Christian." And her father said, "Yes, that's okay. The wise men and the shepherds were not Christians either. They came up to see the baby Jesus." So, okay, if that's the way things are, then I'll go. Yes, I'd like to. He was very touched by the beauty of the liturgy and the very vibrant Japanese Catholic community that was the cathedral. I'm going too long here. Oh no, we're okay. And then at one point he was sent off to war in China, the China-Japan War, which was very bloody and brutal. And Midori, forgetting something important, Christmas night, either the 25th or the 26th, so the day later, might have been the very night after Christmas vigil. They woke up Takashi in the middle of the night, said, "Please, can you come and examine Midori? We thought she had food poisoning, but she still has terrible pains, and we gave her medicine for food poisoning, it had no effect." So he got up quickly, examined her, and correctly diagnosed her as acute appendicitis. And so he telephoned the medical school where he was studying, asked about who was on duty, asked the surgeon to prepare the emergency room, and he carried Midori on his shoulder to the hospital. And the theater was ready, and they operated, and it was indeed appendicitis. And she would have died of septicemia by the morning if he had not correctly diagnosed her condition and brought her in the snowstorm to the hospital. I'm going to forget if I don't say it right now, so let me say. Later on, when they were married, I'll explain too. One night, Takashi went out in the snowstorm to attend to a lady with asthma attack. And on his way back, he himself suffered from asthma and had an asthma attack and fell into a snowbank and couldn't get up. And Midori had spoken to him, be careful. Yes, I know, I have to go. Was worried when he didn't come back in the frame of time that he should have. So she went out looking for him and discovered him fallen into a snowbank, breathing heavily and she had brought a syringe to give him an injection for relief of the asthma, and then carried him on her shoulders back to the house and nursed him back to health. So that I know of no other couple in the history of the world where each one has been given the grace of literally saving the life of the other. So back to when he was a medical student and went to war, she also included things like home spun gloves for the cold winter and the New Testament. So he read the New Testament. I think another time she sent a catechism. And so when he came back from the war, it wasn't long before he undertook sessions with a Catholic priest and was baptized. And within a half a year, married Midori, whose life he had saved and who one day would save his life. They followed the Japanese custom of a matchmaker. Japanese culture apparently has a person that is like interviews each one and maybe their family members and gives their opinion if they're compatible. The only one that had any doubts about their marrying was Takashi. And it was a doubt that he wanted his wife to know and understand clearly that he was a radiologist. It was a new and burgeoning science in those days, in the 1830s or 40s. But it was known that radiologists died young of leukemia, an extraordinary percentage. They didn't know why. In the very early years of radiology, this is perhaps in the first 5 or 10 years, we should look up when Madame Curie discovered it. But at that point, they didn't know about lead jackets and moving into another room. And one form, when they didn't have any more metal plates, would be for him to read them looking straight at the X-ray machine with just the person standing in the middle. So in 1944, while the World War was raging on in Europe and also in the Pacific, he one day discovered that he finally realized that he had leukemia. He was seeing in his body the results. And so he took x-rays and it was clear as a radiologist. But just to be sure, he asked some of his colleagues to come to give an opinion on this x-ray plate, and they said advanced leukemia, 2 or 3 years to live. And it was hard enough for him to hold his composure among his colleagues, but he was deathly afraid of breaking the news to his wife. He had 2 small children that had 2 miscarriages. So just 2, a boy and a younger girl. They were like 3 and 5 at the time. So he went back, but he was a Christian man. He couldn't pretend he didn't have it. He asked his wife to sit down and told her. And then he waited for her response. She got up and went over and knelt down before a family altar that they had. He went down and knelt down beside her. And then at one point he saw she was like shaking. He realized she was sobbing but trying to stifle. And he felt like the worst person in the world. But then she calmed down. And only then did she turn to him and said, "Remember what we agreed when we married. We said life is beautiful when we're following God's will. Life and death are beautiful when we're doing this, when you are following your vocation as a scientist to learn more about medicine and the human body. We said, we are in this together. Whatever happens to you, I am ready to accept." And he said, he wrote later, it was like a huge burden being lifted from his shoulders when she said that. And the next day he went to the hospital, and he said it was almost like he wanted to kiss the X-ray machine. It was like a discovery of confirmation of his vocation to married life, but also to a dangerous experimental field of science. That his purpose was not to make a name for himself, but to learn for medical knowledge. But things don't always turn out as expected. In 1945, it was 1945 when he discovered he had leukemia, like February or March. 1945, August 6th, the U.S. dropped an atom bomb on Hiroshima, which is quite a long ways away from Nagasaki. 3 days later, they dropped a second atom bomb on Nagasaki, right on, it wasn't the purpose of the flight, but they had to have a clear sky to see where to drop it. Nagasaki was also a shipbuilding port, crucial for the Japanese war effort. So it was actually a second choice. The one that they wanted to drop it on was too cloudy. And in that atom bomb, I don't have the figures here, but hundreds of thousands, at least tens of thousands of people died instantaneously. And others died a day later, a week later, a month later, some a year or 2 or 3 years later. Midori was carbonized. She was in the zone right near, ground zero, where the bomb had exploded, and Takashi was, however, survived. He was in a hospital of concrete walls. Their Japanese house was just a very flimsy sort of house, wooden house. But the concrete walls, particularly the radiology lab, permitted him to survive. And about 20% of medical personnel survived. And so he began the emergency rescue effort, not rescue, but attention. But what they could do is like putting a bandage on an open wound, gashing wound, because the first place the hospital was destroyed. He was thrown across the room against the wall by the impact of the atom bomb. There were fires and darkness and things, so the hospital, there was practically nothing they could salvage. And people, knowing this was a hospital, those who survived the bomb, started coming in pairs and families and dozens and hundreds, asking for some sort of help. And all they could do was palliative. They were eaten up by an incredible thirst. But giving them water would not help. People's skin fell off. It's absolutely horrible. And after 3 days, the Japanese military came to relieve this incredible team of people that had been attending for 3 days and 3 nights. Finally, Takashi could go and look for Midori. He was hoping he would see her among the ghosts of people that came to the center, to the hospital, but after 3 days he realized she must be dead. It was with difficulty that he even could locate the street they lived on. Everything was just flattened and burned. He finally located the street and the house by some of the foundations. And then he saw among the dust some fragments of bone, pelvis bone. He realized that must be Midori. So he collected her bones in a bucket to give them burial. And then he saw some other thing, glitter. He picked it up. Looks like it's metal. There's metal wound around some bones. Then he realized that this was Midori's rosary, that she had been praying at the moment of the atom bomb. So he was consoled by that, the fact that their Catholic devotion to Mary she would be there at the hour of her death. He didn't expect that he would be left alone to care for the children. He thought she would. He prayed for her, but now he was left alone. But he felt that she was with him. And he lived another 6 years to raise their children. Every day was precious for him. I think he should have done. He fell into a coma even in those first month or so, and woke up to hear a kind of breathing, a technically known type of breathing that's the immediate prelude to death. Keen something breathing. And and then he fell back into coma. And he heard in the coma someone say, "Pray to Maximilian Kolbe." Maximilian Kolbe had been in Nagasaki before he returned to Poland and had a whole missionary work in Poland. He had been several years in Nagasaki, had founded a convent there of friars, and had been to examine himself at least once, maybe a couple of times, with Takashi. But Takashi had no way of knowing what his posterior destiny was. Believe me, in World War II, there was no news that escaped a concentration camp. And if they did, they wouldn't have told about Maximilian Kolbe, who went off to a hunger bunker. There were no transcontinental communications that would filter down to one man. But nobody among the medical or family that survived had ever said that to him. But he came out of that coma and lived a number of 6 more years, and wrote. He was one of the world the best placed men in the world to understand what they were calling radiation sickness or atomic disease, because he was a radiologist already with years of experience. He understood what radiation could do and was involved in his normal work, not just treating patients, but teaching in the hospital. He had the effects of over-radiation in his own body before the bomb. After the bomb, he should have had a multiple lethal dose. I don't know how he survived. And he was among the very first, probably the only radiologist, to treat people in the minutes and hours and days and weeks after the atom bomb. It would be months later before the U.S. sent some observers with the Geiger counters to measure radiation and to photograph the destruction. But Takashi was there through it all. Last, Gianna Beretta. You may know her name. She was an Italian doctor in the 20th century, a pediatrician. She loved especially to serve the poor and the rural, unattended, sick children and the elderly. She would sometimes visit elderly patients without even being called, just to see how they were. She and Pietro Mola became known to each other somehow. She had wanted initially, had thought of religious life to be a missionary in Brazil, where she had a brother who was a Capuchin in Brazil. But she had several health problems that they counseled her not even to consider that. also because of the state of health questions in Brazil. So she realized that her vocation was there in her home country to work for the more needy and marginalized. She and Pietro wrote precious letters to each other, and they had no less than a couple. Well, most of these couples had Louis and Celia Martin, who recognized each other so quickly as having almost identical desire for Christian holiness and family life. So the two of them, we have letters, each one. When Pietro was a businessman, sometimes had to leave for a week or several weeks to go to the US or elsewhere. They would write letters every day, one to the other, no matter that they crossed en route, but they had a very clear idea that they wanted to live as a domestic church, as a holy family. So Jana, who was about 8 or 10 years younger than her husband, was much more of a cosmopolitan person who loved life. Theater, music, concerts, sports, skiing, mountain vacations, all kinds of things. Pietro, it sounds, was kind of like a homebody who just stayed at home, and he went from home to work and work to home. And he found Jana just opened his life up to a whole world of beauty that she enjoyed. She just loved life. And they wanted to have many children. So they had 3 children, but and one almost died at one point when Pietro was away on business. But he came back and said, the greatest gift you could have given me is this child. She gave birth when it was a dangerous pregnancy. And he said, the greatest gift is to come home to see you and the child both well. But in her 4th pregnancy, she developed a uterine fibroma. I'm not a doctor, so I may have some interpretation wrong, just like I'm not a Japanese, so I don't know if I'm calling people by the right name. Takashi is his personal name or a family name, but anyway, that's not so important. The doctors all recommended strongly that she have an operation to excise the fibroma, to operate and withdraw the fibroma, which I think is a uterine cancer, but it would end up aborting the child. They could do something that was very risky. It would only be to remove the fibroma. Or they could leave it. If they left everything as it was, it would be clearly the death of both the mother and the child. So she agreed to the very limited surgery that would only touch the fibroma. Maybe they couldn't be sure they got it all or something anyway. But she insisted with her husband. She had another brother who was a doctor in Italy who came to give his opinion. And she said to her husband just weeks before giving birth to a healthy young daughter, while I was still very iffy, she said, if it comes down between the child and me, choose the child. I insist upon it. She made it very clear to all her doctors they were not to act against the life of the baby, even to save her life. In fact, they had painted a very grim picture that both of them could die. But she said, no, save the baby. And on Good Friday, 1962, I think, yes, 1962, this is right within living memory of some of us, she gave birth to a daughter, a healthy daughter, that they named Gianna Emanuela, after her mother. A week later, Gianna died, the mother, of complications from the early surgery. She had septicemia, and amidst very great pains and suffering for a couple of days, she said, "Jesus, I love you, Jesus," and died, leaving her husband with 4 children, one a week old, one a year and a half old, and the other 2 like 3 and 5. I've just been meditating lately upon what her husband must have gone through. He knew his wife's decision of conscience. They loved each other, they trusted each other, they trusted in the Lord, but still that's an awful thing to leave. Midori didn't have to choose. It was chosen for her. And she was instantaneously killed. But Pietro and Gianna had to choose this and face it. Gianna's daughter, the last born, the 4th one, Gianna Emanuela, later became a medical doctor like her mother. And she was serving as a doctor for a number of years till her father became elderly, and she realized as a doctor, as a daughter, she should care for him. They moved in with him, cared for him in his last years. But before he died, they began talking about the process of beatification for his wife. I've listened to an interview once where a cardinal of their part of Italy was talking with Pietro, and he said, "What would you think about if we started a process of canonization of your wife?" And he was at first kind of resistant to the idea, because he felt Gianna is ours. She's our family, our mother, our wife. I don't want her to be all over the world. I don't want her body to be exhumed from a cemetery and put in some church or something. So he initially was not that hot on the idea, but gave his permission. And when he started receiving letters from all over the world, people that were inspired by her example and who, in some cases, attributed healings or safe deliveries or other things to Gianna's intercession, he began to see why and changed his earlier resistance. They need miracles as a kind of God's seal of approval upon the human judgment that's made in the canonization process. So someone by intercession of that saint, that would-be saint, has to be examined by the church. And when there's no human explanation, they will accept that as a proof that God himself indeed has worked through Gianna's prayers in this case. Well, one of the 2 people that was 2 miracles that were submitted and accepted for beatification, canonization, was a family in Brazil. May got the 2 mixed up, but one of them, there was a child born who went through his whole pregnancy without an amniotic fluid. They discovered when the woman went for a test that she had no amniotic fluid. And yet the child was born healthy, having asked the intercession of Gianna Beretta. I think that one may have been in Italy, and the other one was in Brazil. It's another case of delivery that was extremely risky and probably not any hope for success, and extraordinary delivery. So, hopefully this is not the end for you, but rather the beginning of a whole new experience of holy friendship with some of these married saints. That's my hope for you. Now, do we have the handout? I figured you would like to know more about these people than just a 5-minute thumbnail sketch. So I worked up a sheet. Okay. These are some internet e-resources. Since you may not have access, I just went to Barnes and Noble's this afternoon on Chestnut Street, and I found not a single Christian biography. I guess that's not their focus. But I've been looking around Washington, D.C., where I live, and I found 1 or 2 books available. But you don't have to travel that far, since I imagine all of you, without exception, have access to internet somewhere, if not at home in a public library. Here are some places to start your study. And a little bit of an explanation of what's at these different sites. If any of them don't work for you, please check with me. If you want to leave me your emails, I will be happy to send you by electronic version these, because if you miss a dot or put a dot instead of a comma, it doesn't work, as you know. So it's a lot easier to transmit URLs electronically than, a lot more useful than in paper. But in case we don't have contact, or would I forget to ask you to give me a list of your emails. Let me do that right now. And I have one. Would anybody like to just a name and an email? I'd appreciate if you'd like to receive some. I don't want. Also on this board here, sandwich board, you've got a. This is I'm giving a similar course in Washington D.C. at the parish where I'm assigned, St. Dominic's, and I have a group about this size, a little bit bigger, 10 or 12 people, that have been following married saints from a few biblical and centuries past examples, but now we're in the central part of the course. 11 married saints. All of these, 7 are among them. There's another 5 as well. And every Sunday at 9:15 to 10:15, we have a session that a very wonderful Dominican layman has put on internet, on Zoom, and now also recorded versions with the texts on internet. So if you want to come by Zoom and attend any of our sessions, they just last an hour, because it's like here, only a half an hour earlier. After the morning mass at 8, we begin at 9:15. We finish at 10:15, so people can go to the midday mass at 10:30. Here it might half an hour different, but if you Google Dominican Witness, a page will come up, a picture of Our Lady or something. And if you choose the menu, you go to the bottom of that. In fact, let me show you. Nothing like seeing. So here's the page that will come up, Dominican Witness. Oops. And if we scroll down a bunch of menus, study. Can't see that, but take my word for it. And then at the bottom of that list, the most recent addition is, what's this? Wait, that's the wrong one. Okay, go back, try that again. Study. Oh, I see what I did. There we go. Welcome. In the church, there's a diversity of ministry, but a oneness of mission. I'm not sure that's mine. I understand. No, this is about Dominican ladies. So anyway, if you write this down, I've managed to find it before. I don't know what now, but there you can get much longer, still not a book, but much longer, like 18 pages or 15 pages on most of these. And like Pierre Toussaint, it's a memoir written by one of his lady friends, a white lady, who a year after his death wrote a memoir that has most of the information we know about Pierre Toussaint, like 80 pages, something, and the selections from that. In a few cases, there are videos. One of the ones in this session that I've not done here, because it's so drastic, is a couple martyred in Rwanda during the genocide. That's the only African couple I have. So there are different things. I'm not in charge of this. This Dominican layman is. He puts things up, and I could give you, if you want to write him, if you're having some trouble, just put W-N-E-K. That's his last name, which is pronounced Vanek or something like that. Janusz. And you can just, well, I don't know if you can. No, maybe this wouldn't come up in Google. His email is vanekfamily at gmail.com. On my computer it comes up, but you're not going to have my computer. I try compose. Janusz Vanek family at verizon.net. So WNEK family at verizon.net. He would be happy to hear from you and help you figure out things. There is a Zoom page where you can attend on Sunday mornings if you want. He's got that. Although it might look like it, I'm not a whiz in computer stuff, so that's why I cornered Hyacinth this morning to say I want to test everything out. I've been too many times when the first 20 minutes are trying to plug things in and open things up, and so now we have a few minutes left. Oh, almost over. But any questions or comments? Yes. Right. Yes. couples that had, I don't think, well, there's one, France.
Or even if they weren't the same, even if they didn't become devoted to the same couple, if you have any stories about the impact of any of these married saints on any other married persons.
Well, in my personal experience, I've had a lot of couples that have said, this is incredible, this is wonderful, which, of course, motivates me to continue sharing. There was one, Francis. Oh, yes, one couple, Franz and Franziska Jägerstätter, Austrian peasant who stood up to Hitler's war machine as a conscientious objector and went to prison and then was court-martialed and beheaded. He had 3 young daughters, but his wife, Franziska, I think they married on the feast of St. Francis of Rome, who was a 14th century woman who, with her sister-in-law and with the permission and support of their 2 husbands, did charitable works all around Rome. So they seem to have had some particular devotion to Francis of Rome. Most of the couples that I'm seeing, I don't think could cash in on this 21st century interest in married saints. So they, as I said, it's about the last 25 years, since more or less year 2000, when many countries have been proposing couples for canonization. And the church seems to, the bishops and the priests in this department of the Vatican that has to do with canonization processes. They've kind of realized the importance of favoring them over some 13th century widow or something like that. And now, who is it? Somebody was telling me just recently that they've, for the first time, seen in the missal, like Gianna Beretta, married woman, or mother and wife, or something like that, as opposed to holy woman or widow. Anything else? Yes.
I'm just curious, what moved you to become so passionate about this topic and do all of the wonderful research that you have, especially as a priest yourself with a different vocation. It's just beautiful to see your passion. So I'm curious where you came from.
I am passionate about it. As I mentioned to a few who are here at the very beginning, I've worked for many years, both in the U.S. and then in Peru, with couples in a movement called Teams of Our Lady, which is a couples movement. It's not based on a weekend retreat like Marriage Encounter, but it's permanent cells, like 5 to 7 couples and 1 priest that meet monthly and study a topic and come together for a meal, prayer, giving account of how their Christian commitment is to each other, and study a long monthly meeting. And that's the basic root thing of this movement, but it goes on years and years. These groups sometimes grow old together when they were begun in their 30s. And I have been with 3 teams. One that was the age of my parents when I was in Washington in seminary. One which were my age, practically, when I went to Peru, and then having moved to another place, I ended up marrying various couples that were all on fire for the Lord and were part of a little prayer group and things. And then I suggested that maybe you would like to do this thing, and none of them had any idea, but they also formed a group where they could be my children in age. So I had an interesting combination of ages, but that I would attribute most of all as what really, because that's a married spirituality movement that couples that want to live a holy life and realize they shouldn't go it alone join this. There's also some communication between teams. Teams are those little groups. And there's an international movement that prepares materials. One of my greatest joys in terms of diffusion of this stuff, and you're right, I've been researching for 20 years. Having access to seminary libraries was one of my greatest incentives, but greatest joys was when I got a letter from Teams of Our Lady in Brazil. And they said they had come across some things on the internet that I had written on married saints, articles that were published in Spanish. And they were in charge of the entire movement of Teams of Our Lady in Brazil for their study material. Each team studies the same things that are provided by the movement. And they said they wanted me to do a 32-page, not one more nor one less, 32-page booklet on like 7 or 8 married saints. Because their theme for that year was holiness in marriage. So I was delighted. They asked, I said, in English or in Spanish? I said, English, better your native tongue, we'll translate. So they translated it and made a little booklet along with their major book for study that year. And they told me that Teams of Our Lady included 27,000 couples in Brazil. So I really was just delighted. They asked me to do it like in a month. So I really privileged that, gave top priority. And it was easy in a way because I've written some other things that are booklets on married saints. And so I've been working these booklets a lot and giving different short things. So this was a question of editing, squeezing into 3 pages each. Yeah, I think it was 4 pages each. It was 32 pages, 8 couples. But it's a great joy. So I really think there's a future to this. And it's not to make money or make a name, but just to make known these couples. Final thing, I've authored a number of booklets, these in Nairobi, where I was working for the last 15 years. And the Paulines published them in Nairobi. But I've checked with the Pauline, the daughter of St. Paul here, and they say, unfortunately, it doesn't meet our editorial criteria. Biographies don't sell enough. In Nairobi, there was the Pauline sisters that suggested I publish like this. I wanted initially to publish a 200-page book, well-researched and bibliographed, footnoted, but they said no, it's not going to sell. But these that are pocket-friendly, friendly price, we can sell. So I've published 7 so far. I'd like to publish about another 6 or 7, if I'm able to, if my health lasts and they continue publishing. The only thing specific to Africa is the last 2 or 3 pages have interpreting these lives, which are mostly from Europe, North America, South America, and Asia, interpreting for Africa from the cultural situation. But I brought a few that we can give out or you can buy if you want. They're just $2 each. And I'm going to leave a complete set of the 7 that have so far been published with Hyacinth, and with the stipulation that they be borrowed and not kept, so that other parishioners can also come in and see what's there and take another one. But I have a few, I think 9 here, that if somebody really would love to learn about one I could give you right now. Thank you.